Hey guys, tonight we're heading back in time to a world where a simple sneeze could cost you more than just a tissue. Picture yourself walking into a grand medieval church. Cold stone walls, the smell of incense heavy in the air, and the quiet hum of a congregation so still you could hear a pin drop. Now, imagine that pin drop is your sneeze. That's right. Something as innocent as a sneeze was once considered not only disruptive, but downright offensive, and it might even land you a fine. You probably won't survive this, at least not without a dose of awkwardness and maybe a few coins lighter in your pocket. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your neck of the woods. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the setting. You walk into the vast, echoing nave of a medieval church. It's a cold morning, and you've come to join the Sunday Mass. The stone floors are rough beneath your feet, the air is thick with incense, and the only sounds are the muted voices of the parishioners who fill the pews. Then it happens. The moment you least expect it, the uncontrollable tickle in your throat, the sudden pressure building in your chest. Before you can stop it, it bursts forth, a loud, powerful sneeze. You try to stifle it, but it's no use. The sound reverberates off the high stone walls, filling the church with an unmistakable disturbance. And just like that, you've broken the sacred silence. In a time where decorum and ritual held an almost sacred place in society, that sneeze, it wasn't just an involuntary bodily function. It was a breach of the sacred order. Now, you're about to find out that sneezing in church was once a serious offense. Historians still argue whether this was purely a matter of etiquette or whether it was, in fact, an issue that involved spiritual beliefs. But what's clear is that sneezing, of all things, was considered a threat to the solemnity of religious practice. To interrupt the service with something as common as a sneeze was to challenge the sanctity of the moment itself. In some places, this seemingly trivial breach could result in a fine. Imagine having to pay for the privilege of releasing a bodily function, and this wasn't just a fine. It could involve a public shaming or even a formal reprimand. Your sneeze might cost you a few pennies, or perhaps your reputation for the day. As we continue our journey tonight, we'll uncover the historical context behind such strict measures, looking at why sneezing in church was deemed such a transgression, and how it was tied to a wider set of bizarre rules that governed personal behavior. As you sit there, the dust motes floating in the thick air, let's take a deeper look at the world you've stepped into. Church wasn't just a spiritual sanctuary. It was a space with rules, big ones. These weren't just about kneeling at the right time or wearing the right clothes. No, these rules had everything to do with controlling how you behaved, how you were seen, and, let's be honest, how much you could get fined for sneezing. You see, the concept of church etiquette was wrapped up in something far more serious than just the worship of God. It was about upholding a very particular image of what it meant to be holy and proper. A place where the tiniest infraction was seen not just as rude, but as a challenge to the very order of society. Imagine, for a moment, that sneezing could not only be seen as an interruption of silence, but as a blatant sign of disrespect. This wasn't just about an inconvenience. It was about maintaining decorum in the presence of the divine. Historians still argue whether such stringent rules were merely about social control or whether they had more to do with deeply held spiritual beliefs, perhaps even rooted in superstition. Either way, the line between spiritual purity and public embarrassment was incredibly thin. And so, the rules were simple. Sneezes, coughs, burps, and yawns all became public matters that required immediate correction. You might imagine the church as a place of peace, quiet, and introspection, but the reality was far more controlled, with the clergy enforcing decorum at every turn. If you got too loud, too disruptive, you didn't just risk offending a fellow parishioner, you risked offending God, and that was a much steeper price to pay. And don't even think about the small stuff. Let's say you happen to be caught yawning in the middle of the sermon. That wasn't a simple lapse in attention. It was laziness, even a sign of spiritual indifference. It was considered an assault on the solemnity of the service itself, as though yawning meant you weren't fully immersed in the holiness of the moment. The same could be said for sneezing. A sneeze was an outburst, a betrayal of the quiet reverence that the church demanded. In the larger context of medieval life, sneezing in church represented a breakdown of order, a small but noticeable hiccup in the highly choreographed performance that was a religious service. The cost? Oh, it could be steep, ranging from a small fine, maybe a few pennies, but who knew how tight your purse strings were that day? To something even worse, a public reprimand from the church elders, a glare from the priest, or perhaps even being singled out in front of the congregation. And the punishment wasn't always uniform. Some places were more forgiving than others. For instance, in parts of England, a sneeze might only cost you a fine. In others, the consequences could be harsher, often resulting in shaming rituals where you were made to publicly atone for your transgression. Imagine having to stand in front of the entire congregation, confessing that you had interrupted the most sacred of events because your nose couldn't handle the dust in the air. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was downright embarrassing. Historians have speculated that such punishments were meant to teach people the importance of control, physical and spiritual. It was one of those times when being human wasn't just about being alive. It was about conforming to social and spiritual expectations. Your sneeze? It wasn't just a bodily reflex. It was a disruption to the divine order. So, as you settle deeper into your pew, hopefully without any further sneezing incidents, think of the medieval world as a space that wasn't just a home for worship, but a place where the very smallest things, like sneezing, carried with them a weight of cultural and spiritual significance. You're still in your cold stone pew, the church's echo wrapping around you like a thick, musty blanket. Now, imagine you try really hard to hold back a sneeze, but no luck. The tickle has become a full-blown force of nature. You're caught in the middle of a sacred service, and that sudden burst of air and noise erupts, sending ripples through the silent congregation. It's more than an awkward interruption. It's an offense. The sneeze in this world is like a small explosion. One historian might describe it as the sonic punctuation no one asked for, while others see it as an act that undermines the solemnity of prayer and reflection. Historians still argue whether the medieval sneeze was really treated as a sin or more as a social faux pas turned legal nuisance. But either way, the consequences could be surprising. Picture what happened next. An elderly churchwarden, eyes narrowed beneath his thick brows, approaches with a scowl that could curdle fresh milk. He whispers, or sometimes shouts, that a fine is owed for disturbing the peace. Sneezing could cost you coins, a reprimand, or, in some severe cases, a mandatory prayer or penance to cleanse your soul and ears alike. The sneezing offender might be told to step outside or even stand in the aisle for a few moments, a public display of penitence that marks them as someone who disrupted divine focus. Imagine trying to suppress not only your sneeze, but also your embarrassment as all eyes lock onto you. The collective stare can be as uncomfortable as the sneeze itself. But why such a fuss over sneezing? After all, it's just a reflex, right? Well, it turns out that sneezing was wrapped up in layers of superstition and misunderstood science. People feared that a sneeze was an opening for evil spirits to enter your body. Or, conversely, that sneezing expelled demons but left you momentarily vulnerable. This spiritual paranoia made every sneeze a little dramatic, a little dangerous, and definitely worth policing. The fine, then, was more than money. It was a symbol. Paying it showed you acknowledged your disruption and promised to keep better control. You might think of it as a medieval version of saying sorry, except instead of just words, it involved your coin purse and public shame. Some accounts tell of people keeping tiny cloths or handkerchiefs tucked away, not because they were fashionable, but to try and muffle the inevitable. Still, the risk was high. You could be sneezing just from the dust kicked up by a passing procession, or the thick clouds of incense that often made noses twitch like someone flicking a feather. One curious fringe tidbit comes from a small parish where a local priest reportedly declared that anyone who sneezed more than 3 times during Mass was subject to an extra fine. The reasoning: 3 sneezes in a row were a clear sign of spiritual weakness, or worse, divine disapproval. Whether that priest's triple sneeze rule was widespread or just a local eccentricity remains debated. So, you're stuck between the bodily urge and the social penalty. Sneezing in church wasn't a simple accident. It was a transgression with consequences that echoed through your wallet and your standing in the community. Your only hope? To master the art of the silent sneeze, or to pray for a sudden miracle that would whisk you away before the tickle became a thunderclap. As you sit there, eyes watering and still trying to suppress the urge to sneeze, you wonder how people in the medieval era viewed something so natural. To us, sneezing is simply a bodily function, something that happens when we're sick, allergic, or exposed to a sudden burst of dust. But in the past, the act of sneezing carried a much more profound weight, deeply intertwined with ancient beliefs and fears. Let's dive into the health myths of the time, where sneezing wasn't just a reflex to expel irritants from your nose. No, back then, sneezing was seen as a gateway to the supernatural, a symptom of spiritual warfare. People thought that sneezing could either expel evil spirits or invite them in. Historians still argue whether this was a reflection of widespread fear of disease or a more profound, almost superstitious belief that bodily functions were a battleground for good and evil. You can almost feel the tension as the church, which is supposed to be a place of peace and divine protection, becomes a battlefield. A sneeze could signal that the devil was trying to creep into your body, ready to take advantage of that momentary lapse in control. And who would want to risk that? You could already see the church officials subtly watching for those who were showing any signs of possession or spiritual vulnerability. In some cases, medieval medical texts suggested that sneezing was a way of expelling something that didn't belong in your body, such as a demon or an illness. But more importantly, sneezing was believed to be dangerous not just for the person who sneezed, but for the entire community. Some even thought that the force of a sneeze could spread illness, or more unnervingly, allow demons to jump from one person to another. Now, imagine if you were one of those who was regularly struck by sneezing fits. In a time when illness was often linked to divine punishment, a constant stream of sneezes might not be a simple case of hay fever. It could be seen as a sign that you were in spiritual trouble. Churchgoers, desperate to keep their noses clear, would often use strange remedies, like carrying around tiny vials of incense or herbs to ward off the evil spirits that were thought to cause these disruptive outbursts. Some claimed that simply sniffing the right combination of herbs would keep their sneezes at bay, though whether it was the herbs or the sheer act of distraction was anyone's guess. One particularly strange remedy came from the medieval belief that sneezing could be avoided by carrying a small piece of iron. It was said that the metal acted as a barrier against spirits that might take advantage of your sneezing. People would hang small iron charms around their necks or carry iron in their pockets, hoping to prevent not only the sneeze itself, but the supposed supernatural forces that could take hold during the act. Historians debate whether this was based on actual belief in the power of metal, or if it was just a quirky superstition born from a desire to control the uncontrollable. As absurd as it might sound, sneezing in the medieval world wasn't just a physical inconvenience. It was an event that caused concern from both a health and spiritual perspective. There was an overwhelming fear that something as simple as a sneeze could unlock something far darker, and the idea of controlling sneezes became a way to protect not just yourself, but the community. Sneezing was no longer just a bodily function. It was a sign of weakness, a possible sign of demonic influence, and something that needed to be carefully guarded against. As you sit in the pew, you can't help but wonder whether your nose will hold out long enough for the sermon to end. And if it does, whether you'll manage to escape without drawing the attention of a warden who will charge you a fine for something as simple as a sneeze. But it wasn't just about controlling your body. In the medieval world, sneezing was a sign that you were connected to something much larger: spiritual forces, health beliefs, and a deep-rooted fear of the unknown. As you try to steady your breath and avoid the impending sneeze, the air in the church feels even thicker than before, heavy with incense and anxiety. It's easy to forget, in the comfort of modern life, that back then, the simplest bodily function was not only monitored, but judged, sometimes to extremes. Imagine for a moment how even the smallest infraction, like a sneeze, could put you in the firing line of the church courts. Yes, church courts, where not just matters of faith were examined, but the very minutiae of everyday life. You'd think that church courts, if they existed today, would be reserved for matters of the soul, sins, heresies, and all that heavy stuff. But in medieval times, these courts weren't just for the truly wicked. They could also be summoned for the trivial offenses of daily life, and sneezing was one of them. If you sneezed in church, or did anything else deemed inappropriate for that sacred space, you risked being hauled before the ecclesiastical court. The charges? Disruption, disorder, and perhaps even disrespect for the holy presence. If you were lucky, the punishment might be a small fine, but there were other more embarrassing ways that the court would punish you too. Imagine the scene. You're standing there, probably still feeling the heat of your earlier mistake. The warden, with his stern face and sharp eyes, is gathering the churchgoers for the next trial. The case: a sneeze. That's right. Your harmless sneeze is now the subject of official ecclesiastical review. A group of parishioners might gather as witnesses, and you would be called upon to explain yourself. Historians still argue about the exact nature of these ecclesiastical trials, but one thing is certain: they were used as a means of control, not just for religious matters, but for social order. The church had its hands in all aspects of life. It wasn't just a spiritual leader. It was a community governor, a legal enforcer, and even a moral watchdog. The idea was to ensure that everyone behaved according to the divine rules, especially in holy spaces like the church. So, any infraction, no matter how small, was seen as a challenge to that sacred order. Now, don't picture these court sessions as grandiose affairs full of ancient scrolls and dramatic speeches. These were often small, personal matters, dealt with quietly behind the thick stone walls of the church. Often, they didn't involve much in the way of ceremony, just an uncomfortable confrontation between you, the warden, and perhaps a few curious onlookers. But the results were still the same. You could end up paying a fine for your offense, or worse, being publicly humiliated. What makes this even more curious is how such petty trials often became a game of status. Those with more influence in the community could avoid the worst punishments, while the common folk, the ones least able to afford it, were usually the ones penalized the hardest. And those fines? They didn't just go into the pocket of the warden. They usually ended up as a donation to the church. Imagine that. A fine for sneezing that helped fund the very institution you were worshiping in. It wasn't just sneezing, of course. Church courts could get involved over any number of small infractions. In fact, there were even court cases for things like singing too loudly during hymns or not bowing properly at the altar. Anything that disrupted the peace of the church was fair game. These court cases, as strange as they sound to us now, were vital to maintaining the public image of holiness and piety, and they served as a reminder that in medieval society, personal behavior was deeply scrutinized. Of course, such court cases were also wrapped in a layer of irony. The church, the very institution that preached forgiveness and compassion, was the same one handing out fines for something as natural as sneezing. It begs the question, how much control was really about maintaining piety, and how much was about enforcing social order? Historians still argue whether these small rules were a way to keep people in line, or a way to exercise the church's political power over daily life. As you sit there, hoping no more bodily functions will betray you, you might feel the weight of these rules. They weren't just about keeping the peace. They were about controlling how people behaved, what was deemed acceptable, and what was punishable. And in this strange medieval world, where a sneeze could get you fined, even the smallest of mistakes could have profound consequences. You shift uncomfortably in your pew, glancing around the dimly lit church, half expecting to see the warden making his way toward you with a ledger in hand, ready to fine you for a simple sneeze. But as the Mass continues, it's hard not to wonder, was it only the church courts that had issues with sneezing? Were higher powers also involved? The church, with all its rituals, wasn't the only authority dictating what was acceptable. There was the Pope, and surprisingly, the Pope had something to say about sneezing too. You might think of the Pope as a distant figure, an embodiment of religious wisdom. But in the medieval period, the papacy wasn't just concerned with theology. It often stepped in to manage the mundane affairs of the people too. And yes, sneezing was one of those things that, at one point, caught the Pope's attention. You might be asking yourself, why on earth would the Pope care about sneezing? Well, the answer, as it often is with historical oddities, lies somewhere between superstition, social control, and good old-fashioned religious doctrine. The Pope, or rather papal decrees, played a key role in shaping what was acceptable within the walls of a church. The holy space wasn't just a place of worship. It was an institution that reflected divine order, and anything, yes, even sneezing, could be seen as a disruption of that order. Pope Gregory I, for example, issued a decree about the correct way to sneeze in church, urging the faithful to be discreet, if not silent, when sneezing. The thought was that any sudden noise, especially one as violent as a sneeze, was a sign of disorder. And disorder was a direct affront to God's peace. Historians still argue whether papal decrees like these were rooted in spiritual concerns or simply a way to maintain control over the daily lives of the people. Was it about the sanctity of the space, or was it about making sure that no one broke the rules and disturbed the ritual flow of the Mass? The papacy's involvement, however, added a layer of legal and spiritual gravitas to what might have been seen as a simple social rule. A sneeze was no longer just a bodily reflex. It became a subject for papal legislation. There were even rumors that the Pope went so far as to dictate that a sneeze could, in some cases, signify illness or even sin. After all, in an era where disease and death were often blamed on divine wrath, sneezing could be interpreted as a sign that something was wrong with you, either physically or spiritually. Perhaps a sinner's body was rejecting the purity of the Mass with an uncontrollable disruptive act. Or perhaps the sneeze was a sign that evil was creeping in. And of course, there were even greater superstitions surrounding sneezing at this time. If you sneezed in church, it wasn't just an isolated event. It was linked to a larger belief that every bodily function held significance. Each sneeze, each cough, each yawn was believed to carry some kind of message. In medieval Europe, many believed that sneezing expelled evil spirits, and if you sneezed too many times, it might signal that a spirit had taken possession of you. The Pope's decrees, then, weren't just about avoiding the disruption of the sacred. They were also about preventing the spirits from having any opportunity to sneak into the church. Can you imagine the pressure? To sneeze in church wasn't merely to disrupt. It was to risk exposing your spiritual vulnerability. The act itself became so deeply intertwined with fear and superstition that even the church hierarchy saw it as a problem to be solved. Historians still argue whether this was an attempt to rid the church of any chance of demonic influence or simply a means of maintaining absolute control over the lives of the people. The fear was palpable, as was the drive to regulate every aspect of life, from birth to death, and yes, even the most natural of bodily functions like sneezing. And so, as you sit there, considering the medieval mindset, you begin to understand how sneezing, of all things, became so heavily policed. It wasn't just a matter of manners. It was about creating an order, a divine order that couldn't be disrupted by the smallest of interruptions. With the Pope's decrees and the church courts at the ready, it seemed that there was no escaping the weight of responsibility that came with even the simplest sneeze. Still nestled in the pew, your eyes wander toward the choir loft, where the choir boys, those young, wide-eyed singers of sacred hymns, are practicing their parts for the Mass. If you thought sneezing was just a problem for the general congregation, think again. Choir boys, with their youthful energies and less than robust immune systems, had their own complicated relationship with sneezing and the church's rules about it. You might imagine that choir boys had the best protection, the prayers, the rituals, the divine favor. But no, they were just as susceptible to sneezing fits as the rest of us, and sometimes even more so. The close quarters, the damp stone buildings, and the thick clouds of incense didn't exactly make for healthy breathing conditions. Historians still argue about how seriously choir boys' sneezing was taken compared to adult parishioners. Some sources suggest that choir boys were expected to maintain impeccable behavior, both vocally and physically. If a choir boy sneezed during a performance, it could throw off the entire harmony, and that was considered both a disruption to the service and a failure to uphold their sacred duties. Behind the scenes, there was a curious blend of whispered gossip and secret remedies aimed at stifling these bodily betrayals. Monks and clergy sometimes recommended unusual cures, herbal concoctions, steam baths, or even slightly questionable poultices. One popular remedy was a mixture of vinegar and herbs believed to clear the nasal passages and prevent sneezing. Choir boys were often the test subjects for these experiments, braving the strange tastes and smells for the sake of maintaining church decorum. One rather quirky tidbit from a remote monastery describes a tradition where choir boys were given tiny cloves of garlic to chew quietly before singing. The idea was that the sharp scent would ward off the sneezing fits caused by the dusty air. Whether the garlic worked or just made their breath unbearable remains a mystery. And then there were the social dynamics. Choir boys who suffered from chronic coughing or sneezing could become the subject of gentle teasing, or worse, suspicion. Some monks worried that frequent sneezing was a sign of spiritual weakness or illness, and in extreme cases, choir boys were encouraged to confess these symptoms during private prayer sessions. This intertwining of health and spirituality made sneezing more than a simple annoyance. It became a signal, a symptom that could be interpreted as either a physical ailment or a spiritual failing. Choir boys had to walk this tightrope daily, balancing their youthful bodies against the strict expectations of their sacred roles. Behind the altar, whispers flew. Stories of choir boys who sneezed during the most solemn moments were told and retold, often exaggerated for comic effect. Imagine the scene, a choir boy sneezing just as the priest delivers a key line of the sermon. The congregation stifling giggles, the priest shooting a glare sharp enough to cut stone. So, sneezing in the choir loft wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a social one. It tested the boundaries of youth, piety, and the expectations placed on those who stood closest to the altar. The stakes were high, every sneeze a gamble, every attempt to hold it back a test of will. Historians still debate how widespread these remedies and attitudes were and whether they were confined to certain monasteries or a more general practice. But what's clear is that sneezing was never just about the nose. It was about control, discipline, and the struggle to maintain holiness in every aspect of life. And so, you imagine yourself among the choir boys, lips pressed tight, trying to hold back the inevitable. The scent of garlic lingers, the heavy drapes rustle, and the sacred music continues. Sniffles, sneezes, and all. You're still lost in the sound of the choir's music, the soft hum of voices floating like a warm blanket over the congregation. And for a moment, you can almost forget the strange pressure of sneezing in church. But that's the thing about sneezing in medieval times. It wasn't just about the body, it was about the words too. The act of sneezing could become a social, even spiritual moment, an occurrence laden with meaning. And how did people respond when the sneeze hit? With the ever-famous, "Bless you," of course. But there's more to this than you might think. The phrase "bless you" was more than just a polite thing to say after someone sneezed. It was a phrase rooted in superstition and deep historical significance. You may already know that "bless you" has its origins in ancient times, but the practice grew particularly prevalent during the medieval period, when the idea of sneezing as a sign of spiritual or physical vulnerability was at its peak. When you sneezed, the belief was that your soul temporarily left your body, and in that moment, an evil spirit or demon might sneak in. A quick "bless you" was a way to ward off that evil, to protect the soul as it made its fragile return to the body. Historians still debate whether "bless you" was merely a superstition meant to ward off evil or a genuine act of religious care. Some even argue that the phrase originated as a kind of emergency prayer, a plea for divine intervention, hoping that God would shield the person from harm in their most vulnerable moment. But one thing is clear: it wasn't just a casual pleasantry. It was a ritual, a kind of spiritual armor against unseen forces. Now, in the church, this phrase took on an even greater weight. To sneeze in the presence of others wasn't just about an interruption. It was a moment of potential crisis, where every action and every word had a divine meaning. When you sneezed in church, you didn't just want to be polite. You wanted to be saved. And so, the ritual of bless you became something of a commandment of its own. It wasn't just a reflexive response. It was a protection, a safeguard against the perceived threat of possession or illness. But bless you didn't always carry the same warmth we associate with it today. For some, it was seen as a mandatory, almost mechanical response, recited out of obligation rather than kindness. It was part of the broader system of rules and rituals that dominated the church at the time, an entire lexicon of behavior that governed everything from prayer to sneezing. And imagine, if you will, being in that medieval church, hearing the soft chorus of bless you repeated over and over again after every sneeze. It wasn't just comforting, it was necessary. It was the only thing standing between the sneezer and possible damnation. The tension between politeness and spiritual necessity is palpable when you consider the social expectations. In some places, if you didn't say bless you when someone sneezed, you might be seen as cold or spiritually indifferent. In others, failing to bless someone's sneeze could even lead to social consequences. It wasn't about being nice. It was about maintaining the right order, showing that you were spiritually vigilant and actively participating in the sacred protection of others. There's also the layer of performative piety that comes into play. People sneezed in churches, yes, but they didn't want to be seen as weak, vulnerable, or easily overtaken by demons or illness. A bless you wasn't just a reflex. It was a mark of being part of the holy community, adhering to the expectations of both divine and social order. It was a gesture that linked the mundane to the divine, reminding everyone that even the smallest action was imbued with spiritual significance. So, as you sit there, tucked away in your pew, trying not to sneeze, you realize that in the medieval world, sneezing wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a moment laden with meaning, a moment when everyone in the church played a part in maintaining the sanctity of the space. The bless you wasn't just a quick response. It was a shared ritual, a reminder that even the smallest disruption could be corrected with a simple act of faith. Historians continue to debate whether bless you was always meant to be a protective prayer, or if it evolved over time into something more ritualistic. What's clear is that by the time it reached its place in the medieval church, it had become far more than a reflex. It had become a small but essential part of the order, both social and spiritual, that defined life in the church. As the music of the choir fades into the background, your mind drifts back to the sense of the church, the overwhelming incense, thick and pungent, wrapping around your senses like a heavy fog. The smoke curls and lingers in the air, and if you're not careful, it might just set off another sneezing fit. It's easy to forget, in the midst of these sacred rituals, that the very thing intended to elevate the atmosphere, incense, was often the cause of these disruptions in the first place. Irony in its finest form. Now consider this. Incense wasn't just there to create an atmosphere or to honor God's presence. It was a tool of both ritual and, in many cases, survival. In medieval times, churchgoers often faced a range of unpleasant realities: moldy stone floors, cold drafts, and an overall lack of proper sanitation. So, while incense was used in religious ceremonies to signify the rising of prayers to God, it also served a more practical purpose: to mask the unpleasant smells of a world that was, frankly, often unsanitary. But while incense was part of the divine order, it wasn't always appreciated by the faithful. The smoke that filled the air during church services could cause discomfort, and yes, sneezing. For the unprepared, the thick, aromatic fumes were as much of an assault on the sinuses as they were a divine offering. Historians still argue whether the use of incense was as effective for purifying the air as it was in setting a spiritual tone. But one thing is certain: if you had allergies, or even just a sensitive nose, the likelihood of sneezing was high. And that sneeze, remember, could cost you. Incense was such a powerful part of the church's sensory environment that it wasn't just something you encountered during major celebrations. It was part of everyday church life, where the thick clouds of smoke hovered over the congregation, adding layers of complexity to the already complex rules governing behavior. To sneeze in church while the incense smoke swirled was to risk breaking the sanctity of the space, and worse, drawing attention to your own frailty. Picture yourself sitting there, the incense hanging heavy in the air, and you feel that tickle again. You know you're seconds away from another sneeze. The irony is almost too much. The very thing that was supposed to purify and elevate the atmosphere is the same thing causing your distress. Sneezing in church wasn't just about the disruption of silence. It was also about the sacred rituals that clashed with the very human condition. The church might offer salvation, but it didn't offer much in the way of comfort from the elements. The real question historians wrestle with is this: did the church know that incense, while divine, was causing discomfort and allergies? Or was it simply one of those divine sacrifices that believers were expected to endure for the greater good? Given the limited understanding of health and medicine at the time, it's likely that the clergy and faithful alike didn't quite understand how their religious practices were affecting their bodies. Yet, the use of incense continued. In some ways, the discomfort it caused might have even added to the sense of reverence, suffering for the sake of devotion. Still, for someone like you trying to sit through Mass without making a sound or causing a scene, the thick incense was the last thing you needed. Every inhale, every tickle in your throat was a reminder that sneezing wasn't just a personal matter. It was a communal one, and it had consequences that stretched far beyond the sneeze itself. It wasn't just a bodily function. It was part of the larger, mysterious interaction between the physical and the divine. Historians also point out that some medieval people believed that the use of incense was linked directly to the idea of purification. The smoke was seen as a way to cleanse the air, much like it was thought to cleanse the soul. But was the purification of the body and soul worth the physical price? The debate continues, though it's clear that for many, the risk of sneezing during Mass was considered a necessary one to maintain the holiness of the service. So as you sit there, trying to avoid sneezing and trying to focus on the sermon, you can't help but feel the weight of this divine dilemma. The church, with all its rituals and rules, demanded silence and reverence, even as it filled the air with smells that made silence nearly impossible to maintain. The incense that was supposed to bring you closer to the divine was the same thing that tested your ability to remain composed. By now, the Mass has drifted on, the low murmur of prayers blending with the faint hum of incense. Your mind wanders back to the other ways people tried to fight off the sneezes that were such an inconvenient distraction during church services. It wasn't just about control in the moment. It was about what you could do before and after to ensure that no sneeze would ever threaten your place in the holy congregation. And this, of course, meant relying on remedies, some of which were a bit dubious, to say the least. One of the most commonly discussed remedies was a drink. Yes, a tonic. Not for health in the modern sense, but more to calm the spirits within. Monks and clergy were quick to share herbal concoctions, often involving bizarre mixtures that they believed could cure all sorts of maladies. Some of these concoctions were thought to suppress sneezing by clearing out the sinuses. Others, strangely, aimed to balance your humors. That strange medieval theory that your body was ruled by 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The idea was that sneezing came from an imbalance in your humors, so a good tonic would bring you back into harmony. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these remedies. In one rather comical example, monks created a tincture involving sage, thyme, and a bit of holy water, supposedly to clear the mind and body from disruptive spirits. Whether it actually worked is anyone's guess, but it's hard to imagine that much thyme and sage could do much to suppress a sneeze caused by the church's overwhelming incense. For the more desperate, there were the more bizarre snuff powders. Yes, snuff. Just like the aristocracy, medieval churchgoers might have snorted powdered herbs up their noses in an attempt to clear their sinuses. However, unlike the richer folks who used snuff as a casual social habit, this wasn't for fun. It was for survival in the pews. A pinch of finely ground snuff was said to both clear the nasal passages and prevent spiritual interruption. The irony, of course, was that it might have just added to the sneeze problem by irritating the sinuses even more. Historians debate whether the snuff was used purely for practical reasons, or if it too carried some magical belief, as people at the time often viewed everything from illnesses to sneezes through a supernatural lens. Then there were the more dubious remedies, like wearing special amulets or charms. It was believed that carrying a small iron charm would prevent sneezing, because iron was thought to have protective properties against evil spirits. Perhaps it worked as a placebo effect for some, but imagine the embarrassment of wearing one of these little trinkets and then sneezing in front of the entire congregation. Would you be seen as weak or spiritually unclean? Or would the charm be seen as ineffective? Either way, it was another social complication to navigate. And there were always the more medicinal remedies. Medieval herbalists prescribed all kinds of strange concoctions to help with sneezing, anything from honey and ginger to powdered rose petals. One of the more bizarre cures involved drinking a mixture of boiled radishes, something that was supposed to open the sinuses. It didn't sound very appetizing, but in an era where knowledge of herbs was limited, desperate times called for desperate measures. Of course, these remedies weren't without their own set of risks. The ingredients were rarely standardized, and people often had to trust their local herbalist or apothecary, who might have their own ideas about what would work. What's fascinating about all of these remedies is how they were intertwined with the spiritual belief system of the time. Much like the incense, these potions weren't just about solving the physical problem of sneezing. They were thought to have a divine or magical quality, bringing peace to the body and soul. People believed that the herbs, the rituals, and the prayers weren't just meant to clear your sinuses. They were meant to restore balance in your spiritual life. A sneeze, after all, was more than just a sneeze. It was a sign of disturbance, and every attempt to suppress it was a way of restoring order. Historians still wonder whether these remedies were more about faith than actual medicinal properties. Were they really effective in preventing sneezes, or were they simply a way for people to feel like they had some control over the uncontrollable? It's likely that the remedies had a bit of both. People might have believed in their magical properties, but they were also just trying to find any way to avoid embarrassment or punishment. In any case, the next time you sneeze, think of all the strange, herbal, and even spiritual remedies that people once relied on to stave off that very moment. Imagine sitting in a medieval pew, clutching your little iron charm, or sipping your sage and thyme tincture, hoping that it would work. The pressure to suppress a sneeze wasn't just about keeping quiet. It was about maintaining your place in a world that demanded order, decorum, and sometimes a little bit of magic. As you sit there, lost in the haze of incense and medieval remedies, you might start to feel like you're in the middle of some bizarre spiritual drama. The pressure not to sneeze, an act as simple and natural as breathing, is mounting. And just when you think you might be able to escape unscathed, here comes another quirky twist: the rise of the snuff box scandal. Yes, in the world of sneezing, where even the smallest bodily function could lead to social consequences, a little sniff of snuff was considered a powerful and often illicit act. Now let's be clear. Snuff was an incredibly popular substance among the upper classes, but it wasn't just for aristocrats. Even the clergy got in on the act, using it to stave off fatigue and keep their senses sharp during long, drawn-out services. What started as a harmless indulgence, however, quickly turned into something far more controversial. The church, with its strict stance on bodily control and purity, became wary of the social and spiritual implications of the new snuff culture. The act of sniffing powdered tobacco, an undeniably personal and private act, could suddenly become a public statement, one that hinted at indulgence, excess, and even rebellion against the rigid structure of church life. In the tight-knit spaces of medieval churches, where everything, from your posture to your voice, was carefully monitored, the snuff box took on an almost illicit quality. Sneezing in church was bad enough, but sneezing with a trace of snuff in your nose? That was a bridge too far. Historians still debate whether the church ever formally condemned snuff use, or whether the outrage was more of a cultural clash between the old guard of piety and the rising tide of personal indulgence. But regardless of the specifics, the use of snuff in church quickly became associated with laxity, rebellion, and a certain disregard for the rules. The snuff box became a symbol of excess. Some churchgoers were said to discreetly offer each other snuff during services, under the pretense of relieving fatigue or clearing the sinuses. But what they were really doing was indulging in an act that disrupted the sacred silence of the church. One particularly amusing account describes a nobleman who sneezed loudly after a surreptitious sniff of snuff, only to find that his fellow parishioners assumed he had just performed an act of scandalous self-indulgence. It wasn't the sneeze they were scandalized by. It was the fact that he had been indulging in snuff during a holy service. The use of snuff became an almost whispered secret. Those in the know would keep their snuff boxes close, but the public display was seen as a violation of sacred space. Interestingly, some historians believe that the widespread use of snuff contributed to a sort of social class divide when it came to sneezing. The wealthy, with their delicate habits and peculiar rituals, could sneeze freely with their snuff boxes in hand, while the common folk, with their lack of social cachet, were often forced to endure the public shame of sneezing without the benefit of snuff to legitimize their discomfort. This growing tension over something as simple as a sneeze began to reflect deeper societal divisions, a small but significant example of how the act of sneezing could symbolize much larger struggles for status, control, and spiritual purity. There was, of course, an even more intriguing aspect to the snuffbox scandal: its connection to the church's obsession with sin. In an era when so much of everyday life was wrapped in the language of sin, indulgence in any form was scrutinized. Snuff, though commonly used in a social setting, was thought by some to be morally suspect, as it seemed to imply an indulgence in pleasure that could cloud one's focus and piety. So, the use of snuff, especially in the church, wasn't just about the social rebellion of the rich. It was also a sign of moral weakness, one that could jeopardize your spiritual standing in a world where every action, no matter how small, was seen as a reflection of your faith. Historians still argue whether the church's outrage over snuff was truly about the substance itself, or if it was more about what it symbolized. Was the act of using snuff in church truly a sin? Or was it just an expression of the growing desire for personal freedom and pleasure in a time that demanded strict obedience to divine order? The answer, as always with history, is complicated. But one thing is certain: the act of sneezing in church, combined with the growing trend of snuff use, became emblematic of the larger societal shifts that were taking place in medieval Europe. As you sit there, imagining the ancient snuff boxes passed in secret during Mass, you might realize just how absurd it all sounds. Sneezing was one thing, but using snuff in the very place where you were supposed to be closest to God? That, it seems, was an entirely different level of audacity. You sit there, trying not to get caught up in the rising tensions of snuff scandals and sacred sneezes, but you can't help but feel the weight of history. Church services in the medieval period were more than just spiritual. They were battlegrounds for survival. You could sneeze, cough, yawn, or even breathe in a way that risked exposing you to something far more terrifying than just the clergy's gaze. You risked the plague. Imagine being a member of a church congregation in the middle of the Black Death. The air is thick with incense, people are crowding the pews, and yet, despite the spiritual purpose of the gathering, there's a palpable sense of fear. The plague was never far from people's minds during the medieval period, and every sneeze, cough, or even a simple sniffle could set the community on edge. In the midst of all the rituals and prayers, there was one overwhelming thought. The person next to you might be sick, and that sickness could be the very thing that wipes out an entire community. During the Black Death, people believed that the sneeze, as harmless as it seemed, was a possible indicator of something far more deadly. If you sneezed in the wrong place, say, during a Mass, you might as well have been declaring that you had the plague. The plague was transmitted through the air, and any hint of a cough or sneeze was met with suspicion. The world of medieval Europe was on edge, constantly battling the fear of infection, and the Church was no exception. Historians still debate whether sneezing during a plague outbreak actually helped spread disease faster. Some argue that sneezing itself wasn't the culprit, while others maintain that the fear of sneezing in church played a significant role in the social panic that swept through communities. Either way, the reaction to sneezing was no longer just about good manners. It became about survival. In the church, there were numerous reports of people fleeing their seats when they heard a sneeze, convinced that the person who had just disrupted the silence was carrying some invisible, deadly force. And if you happened to sneeze in the middle of a Mass, you might find yourself isolated. not just by your fellow parishioners, but by the very clergy who were meant to offer comfort. The fear was that the sneeze might be the first sign that someone in the congregation was sick, and with the Black Death spreading rapidly across Europe, no one was taking any chances. This fear reached a fever pitch during some of the most devastating years of the plague. People sought protection not just in the form of prayers, but through superstitions and rituals. Sneezing became an act of terror. People turned to holy relics, chanting, and even the wearing of protective charms, anything that might offer some small measure of safety against the invisible forces that the sneeze was thought to release. But even as people sought comfort in religious practices and magical protections, there was no denying that the real issue was fear of the unknown. The plague seemed to strike at random. Nobles and peasants alike were struck down without warning. The same went for those who might sneeze in public places, especially in the church. The sneeze was no longer just a reflex. It was a potential signal that you were the carrier of a deadly disease. In a world where so much was unknown about disease transmission, sneezing was suddenly a symbol of mortal danger. Even the most sacred of spaces, like churches, became breeding grounds for fear. The closeness of the congregation, the packed pews, the shared air, everything that made a church a place of community also made it a potential death trap during times of plague. If you sneezed in church during a plague outbreak, you might not just be looked at with disdain. You could be ostracized, forced to leave the service, or even face quarantine. This fear wasn't just about hygiene, it was about survival. The church became both a refuge and a place of danger, where a single sneeze could change the course of the community's fate. As the Black Death continued to ravage Europe, church leaders tried to offer comfort through their prayers and blessings, but even they were not immune to the fears that plagued their flocks. And while the clergy offered prayers for the souls of the sick, many were also scared for their own lives, especially when faced with a sneeze that could be the precursor to something far worse. Historians still debate whether the mass fear of sneezing contributed directly to the spread of the plague. But one thing is clear. In a world where survival was uncertain, every sneeze was treated with suspicion. People clung to anything they could to avoid the inevitable, even if it meant turning against one another in fear. As you sit there, imagining yourself among the terrified parishioners, you can feel the tension in the air. Sneezing, once just a natural reflex, has now become a sign of possible doom, and in the midst of it all, the church tries to hold together a community on the brink of collapse. As you sit in the church, surrounded by whispers and the ever-present tension, it's hard to ignore the weight of the situation. You're not just worried about sneezing anymore. You're thinking about survival. The plague has cast a long shadow, and it's clear that this moment in time has changed everything. The church, with all its rituals and traditions, is now caught in a precarious balancing act, trying to maintain its sacred place while also addressing the very real threat of disease. But this was nothing new. For centuries, the church had dealt with outbreaks of illness, from the Black Death to countless other plagues that ravaged Europe. The response to these health crises was multifaceted, but one thing remained constant. The church had always been a central part of the healing process. But as the plague spread, the once sacred space of the church, where you would seek solace, began to take on a much more practical role. It became a place where not only prayer, but also disease management was part of the daily rituals. The faithful no longer saw the church purely as a place of worship, but as a potential lifeline. The church's role in health matters went beyond simple prayer. In the Middle Ages, Church leaders and monks often doubled as the community's healers, offering advice and remedies that ranged from the scientifically questionable to the downright strange. And with the increasing threat of the plague, there was an even greater focus on health. But the line between faith and health was always blurry. The church encouraged prayer for healing, but many also turned to superstitions, charms, and even dangerous remedies. It's fascinating how, during times of widespread illness, people would mix faith and folk medicine to try to protect themselves. You might imagine the church as a place where people were supposed to find peace and comfort in their faith. But during the plague, it was a place of tension. No longer just a space for spiritual reflection, the church became a battlefield, one where survival meant navigating through prayers, rituals, and health advice that didn't always make sense. You can picture yourself in the pew, eyes darting around, wondering who might be sick and how long you have until the next sneeze or cough. But this didn't just affect the peasants or common folk. Even the clergy weren't immune to the dangers of the plague. In fact, many priests and monks were among the first to fall victim to the disease. It was the clergy who often worked closest with the sick, offering prayers and last rites, and sometimes using their own remedies to treat the afflicted. However, the irony here is palpable. These very same religious figures, who were meant to lead their communities in faith, were just as susceptible to the plague as everyone else. One of the church's responses to the growing fear was the practice of tithes. While the faithful feared the disease and looked to their church leaders for protection, the church needed resources more than ever. There were rumors, some true, some exaggerated, that the church had begun to require additional tithes from its congregation to help fund the care of the sick and the maintenance of the church during times of plague. This only added to the growing tension between the church's need to stay afloat financially and the mounting fear among the people. Interestingly, as the plague wore on, the church began to shift its focus from simple protection to dealing with the spiritual aftermath. The idea that the plague was a punishment from God took hold in many parts of Europe, and as people sought comfort, they often turned to the church for both physical healing and spiritual redemption. The church didn't just offer safety from the disease, it offered solace to the terrified soul. Historians still argue about how the plague's impact on the church might have affected medieval society. Was the church's attempt to maintain a semblance of normalcy during these dark times a desperate attempt to keep power? Or was it genuinely an effort to support a frightened and suffering population? The truth probably lies somewhere in between, with a mixture of politics, faith, and fear all coming into play. So as you sit there, imagining what it must have been like to be a part of that fragile community, you begin to see just how much sneezing had come to represent more than just a bodily reflex. It had become a symbol of something deeper: fear, survival, and a desperate attempt to cling to faith in a world that had become a little too unpredictable. Every sneeze, every cough, every touch of the hand was a reminder that, in a world plagued by disease, nothing could be taken for granted, not even your own health. The church, which once promised protection and safety, had now become a place where the line between the sacred and the practical blurred. As the world outside crumbled, people clung to the rituals, hoping for a divine intervention that would never come. And so, as you sit there, the fear of sneezing becomes even more palpable, because in this moment, you're not just worrying about breaking the silence of the Mass, you're worrying about your very survival. By now, the atmosphere in the church feels thicker than the incense that hangs heavy in the air. It's as if time itself has slowed down, and with each passing moment, the weight of medieval anxieties presses down even harder. The plague has left its mark on the collective psyche, and you can almost feel the sense of unease permeating the very stones of the church. You can hear the occasional cough in the distance, the shuffling of feet, and the whispered prayers of the faithful, all woven together in a fragile tapestry of survival. But amid all this fear, there's another layer to the drama unfolding. It's not just the plague that has turned sneezing into a social sin. There's also the evolution of societal norms. In the past, what might have been an embarrassing but minor distraction became, in the medieval world, an act that carried far more weight. Social decorum wasn't just about following rules. It was about signaling your place in the community and your piety. As sneezing became something to be regulated, it also became an opportunity for the church to exert its power, one sneeze at a time. You might imagine that a sneeze in the context of medieval church life would have been nothing more than a small inconvenience. But no, it became a social marker, a test of your ability to conform to the rigid rules set by the church. For the common folk, this meant being constantly on edge, worried that any public display of human imperfection would draw unwanted attention and potential punishment. For the clergy and those in power, it became another tool in their arsenal for controlling social behavior and maintaining the illusion of spiritual order. Historians still argue whether these public regulations were truly intended for spiritual benefit or were more about maintaining a visible social hierarchy. In medieval society, the church was not just a place of worship, it was also a means of structuring social relationships. By regulating something as trivial as sneezing, the church could reinforce its control over the daily lives of the people. A sneeze wasn't just a bodily reflex. It was a potential transgression, a moment when your position in society might be questioned. And so, you begin to see how sneezing, once a simple, natural act, became so fraught with social and spiritual consequences. In the middle of the church, where everyone was expected to maintain a certain level of decorum, the very act of sneezing could expose you as someone who was either not in control of their body, or worse, someone who was spiritually weak. The church was quick to remind everyone that maintaining control over the body was a direct reflection of your inner state. If you couldn't control your sneezes, how could you be trusted to control your thoughts, your actions, or your faith? This, of course, extended beyond the church pews. In medieval society, the expectation was that the piety of a person would be reflected in every action: how they ate, how they slept, how they behaved in public. Even the smallest actions, like sneezing, became a measure of your ability to adhere to the ideals of Christian discipline. And when you sneezed, you had to show that you were in control. You had to stifle it, suppress it, or at least hide it away, so that it wouldn't disturb the carefully constructed order of things. The church was a place of solemnity, and every sneeze, every cough, every yawn was a reminder that people were human, that they were frail, that they were in need of grace. But even as sneezing became a symbol of spiritual disorder, there was a subtle shift in how it was viewed over time. As the centuries passed, the pressure to suppress these natural bodily functions eased slightly. The modern world would eventually come to view sneezing as a simple reflex, something that could be politely acknowledged but not punished. But in medieval Europe, the act of sneezing was still wrapped up in layers of superstition, fear, and social expectation. You can almost imagine the relief that people must have felt as the rules around sneezing and other bodily functions gradually loosened. The church, once a place of strict discipline, began to soften in its approach to human imperfection. But even in this change, there remained echoes of the past, a lingering sense that control over one's body was still, in some ways, a reflection of one's spiritual worth. As you sit there, still trying to avoid the inevitable, you realize just how far we've come from that world where even a sneeze could disrupt the delicate fabric of society. In today's world, sneezing is, at worst, a minor inconvenience, easily remedied by a tissue and a quiet, "bless you." But for those who lived in the medieval era, it was a sign of human weakness, of spiritual vulnerability, and sometimes of imminent doom. Sneezing in church was never just about the sneeze. It was a moment that encapsulated the intersection of faith, fear, and social control in a world that demanded perfect discipline. The Mass is nearly over, and as you sit there, waiting for the final blessing, the entire experience seems to have stretched and contorted time itself. You're aware of the echoes, the quiet whispers of fellow parishioners, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows on the stone walls. Despite the looming threat of sneezing, there's a sense of calm settling in. It's almost as if, through all the chaos and fear, something larger than yourself is at play. And that's the reality of medieval church life, where human frailty collided with divine order, where sneezing was both a physical function and a metaphor for the larger spiritual struggles that defined existence. By now, you've learned just how much more was at stake than just etiquette. Medieval churchgoers didn't just worry about sneezing for the sake of being rude. They were worried about survival, about maintaining spiritual purity in a world ravaged by disease, superstition, and unrelenting social pressure. Every action, from how you sneezed to how you carried yourself during Mass, was bound up in the struggle to remain spiritually and socially in line. It's interesting to think about how far we've come, isn't it? Today, sneezing is something we mostly chuckle about. A simple "bless you" after a sneeze is more of a courtesy than a necessity, a gesture of kindness without any lingering thought of demons or divine punishment. And yet, as we sit in our modern lives, looking back at those medieval times, it's hard to deny how much our understanding of the body and spirituality has shifted. We've come to embrace human imperfections in a way that medieval society simply couldn't, and that's both comforting and humbling. As you consider these shifting perspectives, there's a certain serenity in knowing that today, sneezing in church is far less consequential. No longer do we have to fear fines, public shaming, or the suspicion that we're somehow spiritually defective. We've grown to accept that sneezing is just a part of being human, a bodily function we can't control, and one that doesn't carry the same weight it once did. The medieval obsession with bodily control, the social policing of sneezes, and the harsh penalties for even minor infractions were all part of a broader system designed to ensure order in a chaotic world. In that sense, sneezing wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a marker of deeper anxieties, from fear of disease to fears of moral or spiritual weakness. What seems so trivial to us now was once a symbol of much larger societal forces. As you drift away from the church, having survived your own personal battle with sneezing, you can't help but feel a bit of gratitude for the simplicity of today's world. The next time you sneeze, you won't be worrying about divine punishment or a warden's gaze. You'll be able to sneeze freely, knowing it's just a natural part of life, one that no longer carries the weight it once did. The medieval church's obsession with sneezing might seem absurd now, but in its day, it was part of a system that sought to impose order, discipline, and moral purity on every aspect of life. And as strange as it may seem, it's hard not to see how this fixation on the body, the way it functions, and the way it's regulated, reflects the deep anxieties that plagued the medieval world. As the last prayers are spoken and the light dims in the church, you're left with a quiet understanding of just how much we've changed as a society. Today, sneezing is nothing more than an inconvenience. But in the medieval period, it was an act of rebellion, a spiritual threat, and a social faux pas all rolled into one. And in this way, even the most mundane aspects of life, the most natural bodily functions, held immense significance. They were a reflection of human vulnerability, of the fear that ran through every church pew, and of the desire to control a world that was often uncontrollable. Now, as you leave the church, the world seems quieter, simpler. The fear of sneezing, the worry of punishment, fades into the past. You're free to breathe, to laugh, to sneeze without a second thought. And in that freedom, there's a sense of peace. The night is settling, and as you reflect on the journey we've just taken, the noise of the outside world fades away, leaving you with a peaceful silence. Imagine the flickering candlelight in the old church, casting soft shadows against the cool stone, the air now free of incense and tension. Slowly, you start to realize that the strange and awkward world of sneezing in church, with its rules and fears, is far behind you. It's a reminder of how far we've come in understanding our bodies and our world. Feel your muscles relax as you let go of the pressure, the anxiety, the weight of living in a time when every small action, like a sneeze, carried monumental consequences. With each breath you take, imagine that you're no longer bound by those medieval fears. Your body, with all its natural quirks, is simply part of who you are. There's no need to hide or suppress, only to accept and breathe freely, just as you are. Slowly allow yourself to drift further into this gentle space, where the past and the present blend, and where the simple act of being human is just enough. The world of fines, penalties, and superstitions fades away as you close your eyes, the peaceful stillness of the night surrounding you. As the shadows grow long and the warmth of the moment embraces you, remember that, just like the sneeze, life moves in its own rhythm, sometimes uncontrollable, always natural. And in that acceptance, there's peace. Let the tranquility of the night wash over you, each breath slower, deeper, until everything feels calm. And with that calm, you can rest now, knowing that the world around you is at peace, and so are you.